observe how China has figured so prominently in the broad region's economic activities, political choices, and security calculations. To examine all this, we have an excellent panel of discussants. More on an introduction to a topic and an introduction to the panelists in just a moment. But first, let me make a few housekeeping remarks. Our event today will last approximately an hour and a half. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to rewatch online at mei.edu. The Zoom function is closed, but all questions for the panel can be submitted either through the Q&A function on Zoom, or for those tuning in via YouTube or MEI's website by emailing events@mei.edu. I'm Marvin Weinbaum, Director of the Middle East Institute's Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies Program. This event is sponsored by MEI and Polytech, a political risk group. MEI is the oldest organization of its kind in the US, founded in 1946, with a mandate that included not only providing for an understanding of the traditional Middle East, but also a greater Middle East encompassing Afghanistan, and when it was founded in 1948, Pakistan. It accomplishes its educational mission through the work of a body of scholars, a renowned journal, a fine library, and language program. I'll now ask Arif Ansar, CEO of Polytech, to offer a brief few words about his organization. Go ahead, Arif.
Thank you, Dr. Marvin, and thank you again to the Middle East Institute for partnering with us again with Polytech. As you remember, we had done a event on the similar theme back in 2018, looking at the interconnection of Middle East and South Asia in the context of great power rivalry and the growing role of heading and what may be the implications for US. That we're back again, and Mr. Feinstein was there in that particular event, so he may recall some of the key themes. You were there, Dr. Weinbaum, as well. So looking forward to this event, and a lot is changing, as we'll find out in the as the event. We have had the Saudi, a big thing in the Middle East, and that's having a trickle-down effect. A lot is changing in South Asia as well. US is no longer in Afghanistan. Pakistan is having political turmoil, and India is engaged with all sides, with SCO, with Quad, and with BRICS, and involved with Russia in the context of. So without further ado, back to you, and looking forward to a very insightful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. Let me now provide an abbreviated introduction of our panelists and our moderator. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of China program at the Stimson Center. She's been in the past a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute, and before that, Yun was the China analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Beijing. Daniel Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Foreign Policy Institute. From 2003 to 2007, Dr. Markey was a member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff, where his work focused on U.S. strategy in South Asia, especially Pakistan and India. We're hoping to have on the screen, waiting for him to join us, Khalid Al-Mayina, a veteran Saudi journalist, commentator, businessman and former editor-in-chief of Arab News and Saudi Gazette. Mr. Al-Amina has contributed commentary columns for Gulf News, Times of Oman, Asian Age, China Post, Al-Sharq, Al-Madina, and Urdu News. And then Sayyid Muhammad Ali. He has had experience working with multilateral, bilateral government and non-government organizations. Dr. Ali is the author of several peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, as well as a book on called Development, Poverty, and Power in Pakistan. Dr. Ali writes weekly op-eds in the Express Tribune, which is an affiliate of the New York Times in Pakistan. He has been teaching recently at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington universities. And now our moderator, Ambassador retired Gerald Feuerstein, is a distinguished fellow on U.S. diplomacy at the Middle East Institute and director of our Arabian Peninsula Affairs Program. He retired from the U.S. Foreign Service after a 41-year career with the personal rank of career minister. He's had 9 overseas postings, including 3 tours of duty in Pakistan, as well as assignments in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. From 2013 until his retirement, Ambassador Feuerstein was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. So now let me turn the program over to Jerry. Please.
Thank you, Marvin and Arif. And I'm delighted to join this very distinguished panel of experts to discuss a subject that's very much at the center of foreign policy discussion in the United States. While much of the attention to the growing competition between the US and China in recent years has focused on the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese engagement in the Middle East and South Asia has been a growing focal point, as exemplified by China's role in brokering the Saudi-Iran normalization agreement earlier this year. On the Pakistani side, the close relationship with China, which stretches back practically to the founding of the country, has increasingly replaced the United States as its paramount great power relationship. Our objective today will be to consider the implications of these developments for the region and for the US. How does China see its future engagement with the region? Are its goals purely economic, or are they increasingly political and security focused? How does the region perceive the growing Chinese presence? Looking at the experience of China's involvement with Pakistan and with Africa, do the Gulf countries see risks in welcoming greater Chinese participation? Given long-standing ties to India, are there limits to how far the Gulf countries will go in building links to China? And are we seeing the outlines of a developing US strategy to build on India's regional presence to limit the Chinese role? How does the US I2U2 initiative, as well as Jake Sullivan's recent discussions in the region to pursue major infrastructure projects with India, affect China's regional initiatives? And how do these efforts implicate Pakistan's interest in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project? So to begin this conversation, I want to go first to Yun Sun to ask her to describe the Chinese vision. How does China perceive the region and its role? What are its long-term goals and its relationships in the region? Yun?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the invitation to be on this distinguished panel. I'll focus primarily on how the Chinese envision things and how the Chinese policy formulation towards this region is determined by some of the internal bureaucratic setup, as well as the primary definition of the Chinese national interest in this region. First of all, I think for the Chinese foreign policy, the Middle East and South Asia are two distinct regions. They're not necessarily always combined together as one region. And then when I look at the setup at State Department, I think there is some similarity there. And if you look at the bureaucratic setup, for example, at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, these two regions are handled by two very different departments. So the Asian affairs, which includes Asia, South Asia, is being handled primarily by the Department of Asia. And the Middle East, in contrast, is handled primarily by the Department of what the Chinese call West Asia and Africa, which basically is MENA. So these two distinct circles, I would say two distinct bureaucratic agencies or bureaucratic institutions, they come from different language background. They come from different sources of, for example, the training of the diplomatic expertise. They also look at very different diplomatic careers and diplomatic focuses in their work. But one thing is for sure that the overlapping or the interconnection between Middle East and South Asia has been growing for Chinese foreign policy. But I don't think that these growing overlapping interests or overlapping issues have really combined these two regions to become one for the Chinese policymakers to consider as a whole. So first, in terms of China's interest in the Middle East, is still primarily focused on energy. And we know that around 50%, or some would say 52% of China's energy import currently still comes from the Middle East. So if we compare this percentile to, for example, China's arms sales to the region, or China's infrastructure contracts in the region, or even the Chinese trade and investment in the region, this the importance of Middle East represents for China in terms of energy security is exceedingly high. Just give you a comparison, the total trade between China and the Middle East is about 7% of China's global total, but the energy dependence is as high as 52%. And so far, observers would say that the maintenance or the protection of China's national interest in the region for Beijing has been achieved primarily through balancing diplomacy. That China has maintained good relations with both Saudi and Iran at the same time, as well as between Arab world and Israel at the same time. So through developing commercial ties and political ties through all players in the region, I think the Chinese has been able to maintain relatively good relationships with all players. And of course, this has led to a question that's quite popular here in Washington, which is, well, there will be a day that China will be forced to pick a side among these very different players with very different interests. There might be that day, that inevitable end game for China, but so far it has not been a existential threat for China's strategy in the region. And I think it's primarily because the Chinese interest in the region, especially the commercial ties with a lot of the players in the region, they can be maintained with China also maintaining the similar type of relationship with adversaries of some of these countries. And one example that, well, since March, everyone has been talking about is the peace deal that China brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the assumption that China is somehow assuming the role of a peacemaker in the Middle East from now on. I don't know if the Chinese believe that. I think the Chinese would like to take the credit for the deal, with the understanding that this deal had been negotiated between Saudi and Iran for at least 2 years before China was even invited to step in. So this was a low-hanging fruit that the curious question is, well, Saudi and Iran both would like to give China the credit instead of giving it to anyone else. So I think coming to the prospect of China as a peacemaker in the Middle East, I think the Chinese have much more sober understanding in terms of what they can achieve, for example, between Israel and Palestine. So although the Chinese new foreign minister had already had a phone call with Israeli foreign minister in the middle of April. But I think the assessment in China is that, well, that's a very long way to go. We were lucky with the deal between Saudi and Iran, but it does not make us a peacemaker in the region. We can try, we'll play the role as we can, but to claim that China will somehow replace or displace the United States as a primary security provider or the primary supporter of the security architecture in the region, that is still a quite premature conclusion, even for the Chinese policymakers. Because, for one, in China, there's argument that China should just free ride with the security that US has been providing. And if you look at the Chinese capability, they don't necessarily have the political or the security and the military engagement in the region to play that role. But it doesn't mean that China cannot achieve what the US is not able to achieve in the region. And whether that defines or qualifies China as a disruptor of a US desired regional order in the Middle East, I think that's a very separate, very different question from the one which says that China is going to replace the United States in the region. China's interest in the Middle East is quite different from China's interest in South Asia. To begin with, South Asia is not a primary supplier of either energy resources or natural resources or even economic opportunities for China. I would say that, and Dan can correct me on this, the primary target that China has in the Middle East or in the South Asia has two aspects. The first one is counterterrorism. It's about the regional security. That has always been the top priority for China's strategy towards Afghanistan and to a certain extent in Pakistan. So this counterterrorism or the regional security angle is always going to be featured prominently in China's strategy towards South Asia. And then also in South Asia, the Chinese have this what I call a self-conflicting goal coming to India. So in terms of South Asia subcontinent, there's a very strong desire on China's part to counterbalance India, not balance India, but counterbalance. China's balancing activity only happens when the Chinese feel that India is trying to check and balance China's influence in the region. So it's called counterbalance. But that's on the South Asia sub-regional level, but then on the Asia regional level, and some would argue in the global level, China is trying to retain some affinity from India in order to make sure that India does not align its positions with the United States to jointly contain China's ambition. So these two goals, one on the regional level, sub-regional level, one on the regional level, are not necessarily compatible at the same time, and that creates a lot of the tension for China's policy towards India. And Pakistan is an important component in both priorities for China, both in terms of the regional security and counterterrorism, as well as China's strategy towards India. And of course, with Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, being no longer a flagship project of BRI, but a pilot project of BRI. I think to begin with, the Chinese had the hope that Pakistan could become the example for the demonstration effect of China's development model and what China's infrastructure-led economic growth could mean for the developing world. Well, 10 years after BRI or after CPEC, we will see where that is going, but I don't think the Chinese have completely abandoned hope just yet. Last but not least, very quickly, the connection in the Chinese policy formulation between Middle East and South Asia. I think the first one is looking at the energy security and the security of the energy transportation corridor from Middle East to Asia, not only South Asia, but also to East Asia. I think the Chinese do see a lot of common interest, for example, between China and India. And this reminds me of about 10 years ago when the Iran sanction was threatening both Chinese and Indian energy import from Iran. The Chinese did see that we have some common interest in terms of obtaining the national security waiver from the Obama administration in terms of their energy import from Iran. And another issue is that I think there is an increasing perception in China that China shares common perspectives as well as some common interest between China and the Middle Eastern countries, especially the Gulf countries, coming to the issues of the Muslim countries in South Asia. And this is most evidently reflected in the crisis or the stability issue, both political stability as well as the financial stability of Pakistan. So the Chinese do look at countries like like Saudi Arabia and UAE to jointly support Pakistan in terms of their budgetary support they need. And it also relates to, for example, the development issue in Bangladesh. So I think the Chinese do see a lot of overlapping potential that China and Gulf countries, Muslim countries could work together. I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yun. And there are some of the points that you made that we're going to want to come back to a little bit later on in the conversation. But thank you for that overview. And I want to go next and ask both Syed Muhammad Ali and Daniel Markey to give us their thoughts on the China-Pakistan relationship. And as Yun said, this has been, of course, a centerpiece. It goes back to the 1950s. Is quite central, and of course for Pakistan, an extremely central foreign policy pillar for Islamabad. And so, as the other foreign relationships recede, particularly the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, which has receded significantly. We've seen some changes in the way the Saudis and the Emiratis are also approaching Pakistan these days. So we have this growing dependence, really, on China as their major partner. And so I guess the question is, looking at it from a Pakistani perspective, are they comfortable with that relationship? Do they see their growing dependence as something that is tolerable over the longer run? As the Gulf states are tightening their economic belt in their relationships with Pakistan, how does the growing dependence on China translate? Yun had mentioned, perhaps this is an area where China can cooperate with the Gulf states in their approach to trying to stabilize that very shaky Pakistani economy. Is there concern that Pakistan risks becoming overly dependent on China, as we've seen elsewhere in the region with Sri Lanka, as we've seen in terms of concerns in Africa about the dependence on China? So, Syed Muhammad Ali and Daniel, your thoughts, please. Anyone?
Hi. Okay. So I've been unmuted, so I'll jump in here. So from the Pakistani perspective, besides its turbulent relationship with the US, it has these two long-standing relationships, and in the Middle East with the Gulf states, it's Saudi Arabia, with UAE and other states, sort of aligned with that relationship. And then sort of one of the ironies of realpolitik that on the other side, then it's in the neighborhood, it's China. And the communist, Republic of China and the Islamic, the Islamic State, Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Communist Party in the Islamic Republic, have had this long-standing relationship. Yes, it is a relationship that was amplified and consciously amplified from the Chinese perspective subsequent to the 1962 Sino-Indian War, as one way of keeping India in check. And it's a relationship that has grown over time. Pakistan has been able to balance this relationship in the past when it sided, within the Cold War context, SEATO, CENTO, subsequently the Afghan War and the Soviet sort of invasion of Afghanistan. And it has had this sort of long-standing military relationship. So the current, to bring this more to the present scenario, I think that there is this long-standing sort of, there's been this long-standing gestation period which makes this kind of a natural bilateral relationship. And there is this, while there are concerns within a country like Pakistan that, now increasingly it is indebted to China, but this is a relationship where, from the Pakistani viewpoint, I mean, it had been saying since the last several years that it was, it wanted to convert its geostrategic location, and rather than just being used, for security purposes, to achieve security purposes in Afghanistan in particular, especially also post 9/11, to turn it into this sort of geo-economic relationship. And in whatever form that the CPEC project has sort of the shape it's taking, and I also think that it is more of a pilot project now, rather than a flagship. But this is where Pakistan has been able to turn a geostrategic relationship into a geo-economic one. And and as things stand from the Pakistani perspective, this is a relationship. I think Pakistan would like to play a greater role in in the Middle East as well. It has been toying with the idea of trying to bring, with its sizable Shia minority, to try and bring some kind of rapprochement between Iran and the Saudis, and there has been that conversation in the past. And I think in Pakistan, this the Chinese brokered low-hanging fruit deal, if it was seen with sort of a lot of optimism, and I think so this is, I think, where the situation stands. Of course, counterterrorism is going to remain perennial, unfortunately, if not perennial, a long-standing concern. It's a concern for China. It's also a concern for the US. And in the great game, I mean, it remains to be seen how much Pakistan will be able to sort of, balance itself, especially now when it's confronted with this kind of polycrisis, right? Where it's economics, there's the outfall of the instability from Afghanistan, and then the internal tussle going on, it's very hard to predict at the moment, where the camel's going to sit.
I can jump in on that if that's okay, Jerry.
Please, Daniel. Yes.
Great. So I just wanted to follow up on both of Yun's and Syed Mohammad Ali's excellent comments. In my last book, China's Western Horizon, I basically looked at China's involvement in this sweep of territory that does cross South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. And Yun is exactly right in terms of characterizing China's historical and still contemporary interests as being driven principally in the Middle East. Hello? We're getting some interference. Being driven principally by energy, and in South Asia, though, being principally driven by a kind of an interest in security, you might say, stability, particularly with respect to terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as a degree, maybe counterbalancing, at times maybe just straight balancing of India. And I think what you're seeing now, though, is an increasing willingness, at times even apparent desire, to play more of an actual active leadership role and to translate some of its China's economic influence into political influence, into diplomatic influence, a willingness to take up roles as it did in the Saudi-Iran deal. That might have been something that China would be even more reluctant to have done, say, 10 years ago. Now, not only is China willing to do it, but the players of the region are eager to cast it in that role. And that's what's, I think, to me, most interesting, is to see how, yes, China's influence is growing. Yes, it is being opportunistic at times with its use of that interest and influence. But at the same time, the region is also being opportunistic in how it uses China. And we see this repeatedly, but in quite varied ways across different states across the region. So it's not right to see kind of a single dynamic at work. Each country, in terms of its internal interests, I would describe as political, economic interests and influences within each society, sees potential utility in working more or less closely with China. And this varies dramatically, right? So like India is actually at the leader level nervous and concerned about China's growing influence, and yet still sees economic benefits potentially to having a stable working relationship with China. While Pakistan has increasingly, particularly the army, has made it's essentially gotten into bed with the Chinese even more than it had historically. And the Iranians are eager suitors of the Chinese, the Saudis as well, but the Saudis play more of a balancing act while the Iranians basically have not too many other games in town. So each one of them, each one of these states sees its interests differently, and that gives China different types of opportunities to pursue with each of them. Just drilling down on the Pakistan piece, though, I think what's really important or interesting to note at the moment is to the extent that Pakistan is in the midst of perhaps a generational kind of level of political crisis, which is compounded by an economic crisis, as well as deep security concerns with respect to the rise of the Pakistani Taliban or the return of the Pakistani Taliban, and critical question marks about what's happening in Afghanistan. That's really put Pakistan into a serious bind. And it seems to me that in a series of recent engagements, diplomatic engagements, at the very least, the Chinese have given the Pakistani army no reason for concern about the sort of steps that they're likely to take to effectively put Imran Khan out of politics in Pakistan. That seems to be the direction that they are pursuing. They're taking a very hard line with him. They are not backing away from that. And I think had China had any interest to the contrary, that they've had multiple opportunities to voice that interest just in the past several weeks. It appears, again, from an outside perspective, that they did not do so. I would have to think that given China as a lender of Pakistan, as the closest military partner that Pakistan has right now, and as a historic provider of really important items to the Pakistani state, including nuclear technologies, and as a balancer against India, had China sent a very strong message that Pakistan's army should cool it, let Imran Khan back into politics, I think they would have had to have listened very seriously. It appears that hasn't happened. So there's a broader point here, which is simply that China is involved in politics and security across this region, even when it doesn't say things. And the degree of its influence, born in large part from its economic heft, allows it an important position, even when it's not speaking loudly about things. And that's an important change from even, say, 10 or 15 years ago. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. And before we go to Khalid, to ask for his thoughts about the Gulf perspective, let me ask, one of the real complications in Pakistani foreign policy over the last 40 years or more has been this pull between its neighbor Iran and its closest partnerships with the Gulf states, particularly Saudi and the Emirates. With the Chinese now playing that role between, at least between Saudi and Iran, does Pakistan perhaps see itself as a junior partner in advancing Chinese engagement with those two as a way of in fact, reducing this friction in its policies and in its neighborhood? Do the Pakistanis see that they can be, really China's wingman in this?
Well, Syed Muhammad Ali, I think, made the point that the deal has been broadly welcomed in Pakistan. And I agree with that. it doesn't require Pakistan to, as you're suggesting, be a wingman, to be supportive and to recognize that, Pakistan was in a no-win situation. The more that Iran and Saudi Arabia were at each other's throats, Pakistan has suffered for decades because of that. Sectarian violence, the upsurge in funding of various groups inside of Pakistani society, largely as the result of this kind of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, lapping into these communities inside of Pakistan. Pakistan has really suffered. And so I think it's a potential beneficiary of Saudi-Iran normalization, as also was the point made earlier. A lot of this was in the works before the Chinese got into it. So the question there, the interesting one, is sort of why bother? And I think the point is that both the Saudis and the Iranians like the idea of a guarantor, and both of them see China as a very useful one because of Chinese oil purchases and because China is so essential to the economies, for both of their economies moving into the future. And so if there's any country on earth that could basically, by its sort of subtle movements of where it buys oil, create serious problems for both of these societies, it's China. And so that puts it in the pole position. So that's why it was seen as useful. But on the Pakistan side, I just, frankly, at the moment, Pakistan is not in a position to do much to be helpful to anyone. It's really in its own hole. It needs to dig its way out. Maybe once it does that, it can be supportive of Chinese initiatives. But, China has gotten to the point it doesn't need Pakistan's support in the Muslim world. Historically, Pakistan sort of paved the way to OIC and other groups, and was kind of a door opener for Beijing. Beijing doesn't need that anymore. It's outgrown that necessity.
Thanks, Daniel.
Oh,
Syed Mohammed?
shall I say a few things?
Khalid, let me just finish this and then come back to you.
Yeah.
Syed Mohammed, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So I also think that Pakistan is perhaps, it doesn't have the strategic or economic leverage at present anywhere else, perhaps except Afghanistan, for China. However, there are, from the Pakistani perspective, I think the sigh of relief was that, a few years ago, Pakistan, there was concern within Pakistan with the former army chief going to Saudi, and this fear in Pakistan that it could be dragged into, because of its sort of long-standing relationship with Saudi, into this kind of proxy engagement, not only within the country with the sectarian violence that Pakistan had to experience and all through the 1980s and onwards, but also in the rest of the Middle East. So I think for Pakistan, that is one kind of sigh of relief if there's some rapprochement between Iran and Saudi. And on the other hand, there is also that economic, sort of imperative that if the sort of grand design of BRI, does come to fruition, including, including CPEC going where it's, where the ambitions of CPEC are, and then it linking with the $300 billion announcement, with Iran. I mean, because Pakistan has wanted, if we think back to IPI, the India-Pakistan-Iran gas pipeline, which couldn't happen because over time and because of geostrategic interest, India pulls out and Pakistan has been dilly-dallying on its side. So I think there is an economic interest, and there's also this sigh of sort of strategic relief, even if it can't, exert direct influence.
Great, thank you. And now, Khalid, I do want to turn to you next, and to ask you to comment a little bit on the perspective in the Gulf, and particularly, the fact that historically, traditionally, the Gulf states have seen China primarily through the optic of the economic relationships. Its presence as the number one importer of energy from the region, also an important partner in terms of the diversification efforts of the countries in the region. And so, is this economic perspective, this economic relationship now shifting to become more of a political and security related engagement? And how do people in the region perceive that transition?
Well, first of all, hats off to the West Asia Africa Department of the Chinese policymakers, because they really made 180 or 360-degree shift in the perception of China in the Gulf. Our relations started in 1990, and I'm of that age when I remember that we were so closely aligned with Chiang Kai-shek, and in King Faisal, the late, met Chiang Kai-shek. There were anti-communist organizations funded across. All that is now a thing of the past. I don't believe that the Chinese came in suddenly. They've been doing slowly since 1990. We had relationships with them, but I think the United States also made many follies in the region, and that all was one of the things that helped the Chinese to step in. For example, reneging on so many resolutions in the United States, the rise of Arab nationalism, the attack on Iraq made people look at policymakers as the mainstay of shifts. But remember, there is a constituency. There's a large public, there is a growing population. People talk about it in think tanks and other places. They may not be as vociferous as in the West, but slowly you could see and tell people that why don't we turn a slight shift and go towards the Chinese? The Americans had a great head start. Thousands and thousands of Saudi students studying in America, knowing the American culture. With the Chinese, there was an economic route going on. The Chinese, as the lady said also, were a bit behind in approaching the Arab world. Right now, what we have here is a total change. Thousands of Arab students or Gulf students are now studying in China, if not thousands, hundreds, and I know a lot of them. Chinese language is being taught, people are wanting to know, and at the same time, I don't think so the Chinese really brokered the deal in the way that is being portrayed. There were feeble attempts by both sides, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to get together. In fact, the Saudis stretched their hands. King Abdullah was in Iran. They invited, but because of Iranian intransigence in many parts, the problems in Lebanon, the open statements by Iranian leaders of that we own 4 capitals, all alarmed the Saudis and the Gulf states. At the same time, America was not seen as an honest broker, nor as a dependent partner. This has helped China. I don't think so the Chinese woke up one morning and went in. The other thing is there's less animosity, there is less apprehension about China as a people regarding the West. And I'm sorry to say the confidence level in Western approaches, be it in the economic approach or the political approach, is now eroding a lot, even on the social aspect. So I think China has come in. The energy security was considered prime importance by one of our speakers here. I think it's important because you have a steady flow of oil from here going there. There are no statements in either of these newspapers or like in America or elsewhere, we are going to cut down, we are not going to depend, we are going to go in electric cars. So I think the ground level that has been there, built by the Chinese, slow but steady, it has helped. Also, the Chinese now in that diplomacy, every Chinese diplomat in the Gulf, in the Arab states, speaks perfect Arabic. They come in, they share their perspectives. Regarding Pakistan, the idea that Pakistan was going to be a sort of broker between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think also that's an overkill, because I don't think so. The Pakistanis themselves have their own problems. They have a 600-mile border with Iran. They had problems, the sectarianism and others. So we shouldn't sort of focus on it a lot. But yes, the trend now is go east, young man.
Well, as an East Coaster here, I always thought that that was good advice. But let me ask, kind of another perspective question, if I may, for everybody, in terms of how the region sees China. You mentioned, Khalid, that people are less concerned about China as a nation, Chinese as a people now than perhaps they were in the past. And yet we have this, this history, this situation in China of the oppression of the Muslim populations in Western China, the Uyghur issue, Xinjiang, and all of those related issues. It is always a source of comment and perhaps surprise on the part of American policymakers that our friends in the Islamic world, and I would count both the Gulf and Pakistan in this, don't seem more agitated, if you will, about the situation and about how the Chinese are managing that situation. And Yun, if I can ask you from the other side, of course, this whole issue, and several people have referred to, the instability and the Chinese focus on counterterrorism and concerns about the flow of instability across the border from Pakistan, from Central Asia into China, the radicalization of the Islamic or the Muslim populations in Western China by the influence of, say, Saudi Arabia and others, and how much of an impact or an influence are these kinds of issues having in the way each side perceives the other?
Well, if I may say, we don't see, we are not alarmed at this, that there's going to be a growing rebellion or all. Yes, as a Muslim, I'm concerned about what's happening. Many people are concerned. Chinese diplomacy behind the scenes are allaying the fears of the powers that be in the Gulf and in Pakistan and all. But we don't believe that there will be something exploding so that people will go and, these Muslims there will be so wild enough to create problems across, and especially in the last 4 years, we can see among the youth, and we sit a lot with them, there is not much extremism, and more people are now entering the job market. There is security. The Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, which started before with small confidence-building measures, and then a roadmap, much before, I think, the Chinese. I think the Chinese was the grand finale, coming up and coming right on stage, which was a good thing because it did create a lot of impact. And at the same time, China itself wanted to hedge its bets. They didn't want these two people to fight because economically, also its investments in the area might be hurt. So that's the main thing. But I don't think so. We are concerned about the rising extremism because we don't see. And if there are, they might just come into Pakistan or elsewhere. But we do hope, and I'm sure behind the scenes, the Gulf states and others are talking to the Chinese about the reports, some of our horrific reports about what's happening in Xinjiang and the Uyghur population.
Thanks. Saeed Mohammed, Daniel, and then Yun, your perspective on security issues in the West?
If I could just jump in on the Uyghur issue, because it's one that we do get a lot. What I think has happened here, at least so far, is that China has actually quite successfully framed this issue rhetorically and diplomatically as one of more of national security, and has come up with a narrative that's, I think, more kind of useful than it is correct, that China's repression of large Muslim populations inside of China, and it's not just Uyghurs, it goes beyond that, but it's worst in the Uyghur community, that repression is warranted on the basis of a need to secure China. And of course, many other countries in the region or beyond the region have also had to take steps security related to deal with radicalization within their own societies and violence. And so they can play into that. The problem, and of course, that message is lubricated by interest, by material interest. There's a huge, financial interest in listening to the Chinese and believing what they have to say, and using that interest to shore up your position if you're a leader in many of these countries. Where it seems to have broken down more is in terms of as a political message, is less in the Middle East and more, there's more of a potential for breakdown in Central Asia, which parts of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, border China, and where there are ethnic populations who themselves have suffered because of Chinese policies in Xinjiang. And so here we see ethnic Kazakhs who've gotten wrapped up into the political repression inside of China, going back into Kazakhstan and raising this as a political issue. Now, the Kazakhstani government, like all the rest of these governments, is not eager to play that up because they understand where their material interests lie. But it's become a political issue. And what I perceive is that if this continues, if China's repression continues, and perhaps even gets worse over the years, then what you'll see are movements within these other societies, not so much just being upset with the Chinese, but being upset with their leaders about being so silent on these issues. And that's where the potential cleavage lies. We don't see it yet for the reasons I've described, but if this persists, I would imagine that over time it will happen.
Great. Yun, any comments on the Chinese view of the security issues and the role that, say, Pakistan or Central Asia, as Daniel raised, or Saudi Arabia are playing in insecurity in Western China?
Sure, absolutely. Well, 2 years ago, when Taliban first took over Afghanistan, I think that's one of China's top concerns, that there will be the spillover effect from the refugee inflow. And with refugee inflow, that there will be a growing terrorist threat coming from Afghanistan. And that's why the Chinese tightened, for example, the security cooperation with Tajikistan, because in terms of the Wakhan Pass, the chance of anyone crossing from Afghanistan into China through Wakhan Pass is extremely low. So the anticipation is that the refugee flow will go north first to Tajikistan and then cross into the Chinese border, because Tajikistan and China shares a much longer and much more porous border compared to between the portion between China and Afghanistan. But this spillover effect did not happen, at least not in the past 2 years, not what the Chinese have observed, that the chance or the actual instance of security threats coming from Afghanistan through Tajikistan into China has not been really identified. So that has decreased some level of the Chinese concern about the issue. But it does not remove the issue between China and Pakistan, between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in fact, the Uyghur issue, or the Uyghur militants that currently take refuge in Afghanistan, remains to be one of the most thorny issues between China and the Taliban regime, and potentially an obstacle in terms of the diplomatic recognition. In terms of Muslim countries' support of the Uyghur cause, it happened. It was a much bigger problem for China's foreign policy towards the region, I would say perhaps 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And there were a lot of speculation, a lot of assessments in China about, for example, Saudi, Iran, or UAE and Qatar paying for Chinese Muslims to receive education in their own country and then send them back to China. And there were also instances of being circulated that the Turkish government was basically providing blank passports to Uyghurs. And some of the Uyghur diaspora with the Uyghur dissidents being captured in Southeast Asia, they carried the Turkish passport, but they did not speak any Turk. And that raises a question for the Chinese of what is Muslim countries' support of the Uyghur population and the Uyghur diaspora in the region. And I think that issue is what has been identified as a vulnerability in China's policy. And in China's engagement with these countries, this particular issue has been prioritized. And we know that when Chinese foreign policy prioritizes issue, there's going to be diplomatic pressure, there's going to be political pressure, there's going to be economic enticement or potential for economic consequences. So I think the Chinese government was able to use a hybrid of a combination of different strategies to ensure that eventually these countries are falling in line with China's with China's position. And remember, when we look at the society, when we look at the political culture in these countries and also in China, there's quite an overlapping in terms of the authoritarianism, the admiration for the Chinese political control of the society, as well as this shared component of paternalistic hierarchical social order, right? So I think that aspect has also gained China a lot of momentum in terms of that engagement. But by the end of the day, the Chinese understand the Uyghur issue eventually depends on the domestic management of the issue. It's not just the imported terrorist cases or the incidents, but primarily it's about domestic control. So that's where we see, for example, the digital surveillance in Xinjiang, the issue of the vocational training center that the Chinese set up under Chen Quanguo in Xinjiang from 2017 to around 2020. So those, I believe, are regarded as a much more effective mechanism by the Chinese government to put a cap on the Uyghur issue, while defending against the foreign inflow of the of potential radical forces or components are important, but by the end of the day, it's a domestic control issue. And last but not least, in terms of Central Asia, I agree with what Dan said, that the discontent with Central Asia's government in terms of the Chinese suppression of their minority population has been growing. But when we look at the war in Ukraine and how the Russian influence in the region is decreasing, and how the dependence from Central Asia is only going to grow in terms of their dependence on China, I'm personally not optimistic that Central Asian countries will be doing more on this particular issue, simply because the larger environment and the political context have evolved in a direction that's not necessarily giving them a bigger voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. And I want to come back to Russia in a moment, but first, I think Syed Mohammed wanted to add a comment.
Yes, I do. And I know how Marvin said in the past that morality should not be used as a cudgel, but I'm afraid that it is. China is supporting Pakistan when it comes to sort of what's happening in Kashmir, despite its own Uyghur problem in Xinjiang. Islamabad has been talking about, particularly under the Imran Khan government, about Islamophobia in the rest of the world, but has been very muted in terms of what's happening in the neighborhood with the Uyghurs. The US, sees a lot of problems with religious intolerance, but despite US SURF and other domestic assessments of what's happening in India, the State Department has repeatedly refused to put India, declare it as a country of particular concern. So these are, while of course, yes, it's a domestic issue, but I do think that there's already, in areas like Gilgit-Baltistan, for instance, where there is this sort of, travel to China, and there has been in the local assembly, there has been this concern about sort of, Uyghur wives who've just disappeared. And this is a problem that, if it is not resolved in the near future, is going to become more of a source of concern. And particularly now, because, it's from a troubled area to a troubled area. If you look at CPEC and now this new plan from Kashgar to Gwadar, right, this idea of a railway project, which is, again, a very hefty infrastructure project. But, repeatedly in Gwadar, there's been discontent brewing, same elite top-down policies, the opacity, and then having this ham-handed, sort of ham-fisted approach to these projects rather than allowing sort of some of the benefits to trickle down. I do want to contrast as a development anthropologist by training. I do want to say, though, that, the idea of elite capture of aid, it's not a uniquely Chinese problem. I mean, while the US has been talking about predatory lending to Pakistan, I mean, we have 70 years of US aid to Pakistan, right? And the market mechanism has often, fit hand in glove with elite capture. So I don't know if there's an alternative development model, that Pakistan could be offered to offset this problem that readily.
Thank you, Syed Mohammed. I want to turn to the Russian angle for in a second, but first I do want to remind our audience that if you do have a question or comment, the Q&A function on the screen is available, and we'll be turning to audience questions in a moment. But I do want to ask everyone, about Russia as the kind of invisible element in all of this. Each of the parties that we're talking about today has its own perspective on Russia. For China, of course, a major partnership that exists between China and Russia on the security front, on the political front, for the Gulf states. Although Russia is not a particularly strong partner, nevertheless, in its role in OPEC plus, the Saudis and the Emiratis have been very careful about how they've managed the relationship with Russia. They've been more or less neutral on the issue of Ukraine, despite considerable pressure from the U.S. to be more forward-leaning on this issue, and keeping in mind that the Emirates has a seat in the Security Council until the end of this year, and of course for Pakistan also a very complicated relationship with Russia, and yet we all remember that Imran Khan made his infamous visit to Moscow the day after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and managed to get through the entire visit without any particular expression of concern about Russian aggression. So, how does Russia play into all of these? How do the Chinese perceive their relationship with Pakistan, with Russia vis-a-vis, their goals and objectives in the region, for anybody and everybody?
I don't think so. There's any concern by the Chinese. Maybe another economic, as you very rightly said, the Gulf states have a relationship with Russia, but it's more economic, slightly social, a bit, and especially with the OPEC thing. So the Chinese are another playing field, and the Gulf states and Russia are on. So these are two parallel relationships and are not connected with each other. When you sit and talk to policymakers here, the thing with China is different from how we approach and how we talk with Russia.
If I could jump in on that, I would say in many cases, I completely agree. For some of the other major players across, if you take the region and interpret it more broadly, the operative question is the extent to which Russia is likely to, and may in some ways have already become, China's junior partner, or really vulnerable to Chinese pressure. And I can say certainly, having been in New Delhi recently, in India, that's very much on people's minds, because part of India's strategy for the region, certainly in terms of dealing with China, has been to try to maintain a separate and important relationship with Russia, and to, in a sense, keep some kind of a wedge driven between Russia and China, so that India could continue to count on Russia as a partner, not least in terms of a military supply relationship. And so the fear is that what you're seeing is a breakdown of that. And, Yun mentioned Central Asia. This is also a place where there's a balancing game. Each of these relatively less powerful states, in some cases quite vulnerable to Russian influence historically, have to consider how they can balance between Russia and China. And for them, seeing some daylight between Moscow and Beijing is usually helpful because it allows them a means of negotiating some position of equidistance, if not exactly, at least somewhere in between, and playing them against one another is a useful tool. But the more they come together and the more that Russia seems to not be able to have an independent voice, and China is a more dominant one, that can create challenges for such a strategy.
Can I make a comment?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. I think it also depends on which country we're talking about. Like, for example, in terms of Afghanistan, I think the Chinese have been quite pleased that Russia was the one that actually provided the Taliban regime with fuel and food last winter. And in terms of the Russian trying to gaining leverage, that at least in some of the Chinese views, Russia has been trying to create more leverage against the international community through its support of Afghanistan and of the Burmese junta by supplying weapons and by consolidating political ties. And in the most recent foreign ministers' meetings of Afghanistan's neighbors that China was hosting, or China was organizing in Samarkand, they even started the quadrilateral mechanism among Iran, Russia, China, and Pakistan to talk about issues in Afghanistan. So I think in terms of these type of what we call the conflict countries, the Chinese do see that there is a utility of Russia being a helpful partner, or at least someone who is taking, or at least carrying some of the pressure that's being placed on China in terms of the changing the situation on the ground. And Iran is such a different case. We know that Iran has been supplying Russia with weapons and with drones in terms of the Russian war in Ukraine. And there are speculations and also intelligence saying that China has been working with Iran on that front. So, and then Dan mentioned that in terms of India, I don't think that the impact of the Russia's deteriorated international status is necessarily reflected on the case of Pakistan just yet, but it definitely reflects in a lot of curious questions for India. That in the next China-India, say, God forbid, if there is another border confrontation, given India's reliance or dependence on the Russian weapon system and China's overwhelming influence over Russia's, for example, external trade these days, what would be the implication for India? I think the Indians so far, they're saying, well, there's no impact. But you do hear questions and skepticisms being stated. Then last but not least, there's also Central Asia. I would say that traditionally China has regarded Russia as the primary player in the Middle East because of the geographical proximity and the fact that China is far away. And in China, some have also regarded the Russian strategy of chaos as useful from time to time, because it does create more leverage for Moscow. And in the collaboration between Moscow and Beijing, that indirectly translates into some of the exploitable moments for Beijing. But whether this strategy of chaos moving forward, just looking at the war in Ukraine, whether this strategy of chaos is going to turn more and more into a liability for Beijing, I think that's going to be a major divergence between Beijing and Moscow. Thank you.
So bringing it back briefly
Please,
to the Indian subcontinent, if I may, I also do think that the Russia equation is much more important for India, has much greater implications than it does for Pakistan. I mean, Prime Minister Imran Khan going and laying a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier while Ukraine had started unfolding was just bad optics. But I don't think that happened with ill intent. It was just bad planning and bad management. And Pakistan has now, I mean, I think with US consent, at least, it's starting, despite its desperation, it has not been getting the Russian oil. I think for Pakistan, really, even in Afghanistan, I don't know how seriously Pakistan, views Russia's influence now, in terms of handling the instability there. for Pakistan, I think the US and managing that relationship is much more important. I mean, it is supplying arms and ammunition to Ukraine. And I think that for Pakistan, Russia, in other words, has it's more about India than it is about Pakistan.
You're muted.
Thank you. For Yun and Khaled in particular, the other major development or development in terms of China's relationships with the Gulf states is the decision by several of them to become observers or partners of some sort in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And to what extent do you see that as a significant development and a step forward in Chinese engagement with the Gulf region?
I think it's going to cement the ties more. It's going to cement the ties at all levels. It started with the economy, the Chinese way of thinking, of approving some of the things the Saudis did. It helped also and culminated in the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement in that way. As I said before, the rapprochement had already started, but then the pinnacle of it was the famous picture in the photo session in China, the meeting of the foreign ministers, the benign look that both these foreign ministers, had. I think it's in that step. I don't think so. There's going to be a going back. It's not a spur of the moment or hip shooting that we just decided to go with the Chinese. I think they are coming here for the long haul, and we are going to go there and look around and see how we can go further. We don't know what the future holds, but I truly believe that the idea that we are going to be always looking west is a thing of the past. Not that we are going to divorce America. It's a dysfunctional marriage at the moment between some of the Gulf states and the United States. But I think the Gulf states, the Arabs in general, are looking at a solid partner where the government and the media don't take jabs at us.
On the issue of the SCO, I think it really depends on which perspective you're evaluating the organization. So on a global perspective, yes, the expansion of SCO is seen as somewhat indirect expansion of China's regional influence, and more country identifies with the vision and the political philosophy that the Chinese are having proposed. And from that perspective, it is significant. It's like the G7 is over the weekend was happening in Japan, but then China was hosting the China Central Asia Summit in Xi'an. And I think in today's global political context, people inevitably will see that as a manifestation of bloc politics. But if you look at the efficacy or the efficiency or the effectiveness of that expansion from SCO's perspective, I think the key question that needs to be asked is, what has SCO achieved substantively and concretely, either on regional economic development or on major political moves that basically combines the organization closer to each other? And just to give a few examples, last year when the turmoil happened in Kazakhstan at the beginning of the year, the Chinese were proposing that, well, maybe SCO should be the one that chairs a peacekeeping force. And that was rejected by Russia. And Russia used its own CSTO to send the peacekeepers to Kazakhstan. That was regarded as a slam of the door on China's face. And then this year, India is a host of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and some of the meetings took place, Ben knows this much better than I do, some of the meetings took place in disputed territories. And that raises a question that, well, if we just look at SCO as the organization, that has the organization become more effective in terms of the concrete deliverables as its memberships expand, or it has become less so? So yes, the political symbolism of the expanding SCO, Middle Eastern countries looking at SCO, joining the organization, I think it is significant. But if we look at the concrete damage being done by, or the concrete deliverables that are being achieved through those expansions, I have to say that the evidence is pretty thin. Thank you.
Daniel, did you want to add?
Yeah, I can just, I think it's an interesting segue in a sense to some of the competing efforts that, diplomatic efforts that the United States has undertaken, or at least been a part of recently in this broader region. And the one that comes to mind is the I2U2 grouping. So India, Israel, UAE, United States. What's interesting about this is, it's an entirely new, out of whole cloth kind of concept that is born, in a sense, out of the Abraham Accords, but which brings India into the Middle East in a way diplomatically that at least Americans have been unfamiliar with. I mean, Indians will say India has been present in the Middle East in important ways for quite some time, but diplomatically, and then paired with the United States and Israel and UAE, seems like a strange partnership. So that brings to mind the question, as Yun was pointing out, of just the efficacy of such organizations. You could also look at the Quad in the Indo-Pacific as another, question mark, another interesting grouping: United States, Australia, Japan, and India. Just what are these groups actually doing? I would say, to their credit, Washington and the other partners in these groups have actually tried to put the principal emphasis on kind of practical deliverables. They tend to call them sort of common goods or things that maybe will be helpful to the wider region. They try to focus on things that are a little bit more economic and less geopolitical. In each of these instances, these groups will be judged on what they actually put forward. And, will they actually bring together, for instance, it was recently discussed an idea of a rail, a multimodal pathway of Indian goods going through the Middle East and into Israel and then on to Europe. This would be an interesting development, which would require multiple parties and maybe some American leadership and financing and so on. But right now it seems like sort of a work in progress, which is, again, to go back to something Yun was saying, principally driven by a kind of a geopolitical motivation to provide alternative groupings and in a sense, to provide a different narrative than the one that China is providing with the SCO, to suggest that the United States and its partners are also energetically pursuing different groups of diplomacy and are actively engaged in regions where they are increasingly being accused, particularly the Middle East, of not being as present as they once were. So there's a big global game at work, and then there's the sort of the specific practical measures. And the question is, will the big global game actually yield real outcomes, or just be played at a rhetorical level?
Thanks, Daniel. And let's turn in our last 10 minutes or so to some of the questions, and one from the audience in particular concerns Israel, and you just mentioned Israel. Is the growing Chinese role in the region going to create divisions or some kind of separation between the U.S. and Israel? Will Israeli and U.S. interests diverge because of the growing Chinese presence and role?
Well, I would hardly consider myself someone who follows Israel that closely, but I would say, to the extent that I followed this issue, to me, it seems that Israel has sort of belatedly, or Israelis, many of them have belatedly woken up to some of the strategic implications of their economic and commercial ties with China. And there has been some greater debate in the Israeli policy space about whether, as they get tied up with the Chinese and do arrangements that provide particularly IP, intellectual property, that, Israel comes up, particularly their high-tech sector, whether that could be then exploited by China and will ultimately come back to bite the Israelis, and there's also the specific questions about Chinese investments in Israeli ports, Israeli commerce and business, and whether they're kind of going very quickly into a full embrace of China in ways that will have implications that go well beyond just the straight up who owns what, and really keep sort of expose Israeli vulnerabilities, and maybe even, as the questioner is asking, drive some kind of a wedge between Israel and the United States. But at the moment, I would say Israel is waking up to this prospect, is more sensitive to it, and that the ties between Israel and the United States, though troubled for other reasons, political reasons and other reasons, are not likely to be sort of pushed aside by an Israel-China condominium. Israel may be looking for additional or alternative partners to the United States, but is also, as I say, increasingly aware of the downside risks of overdependence on the Chinese.
Yeah, I would just comment, we had an interesting observation from an Israeli panelist a few months ago I think after the Saudis announced that they were going to open their airspace to Israeli civil aviation. And the panelist said that for the first time, Israel can have a global perspective on the world. It was almost entirely focused on its relationships with the West before, because that was really the only outlet that the Israelis had. And as an example, there was no transit lounge at Ben Gurion Airport because nobody landing at Ben Gurion Airport could travel on anywhere from there. It was a terminus. It was not a midpoint. But with the opening up of the Gulf, particularly, it allowed the Israelis to look east for the very first time in their 75-year history, as opposed to being entirely dependent on the West. And that, is kind of an interesting psychological shift for the Israelis on how they perceive their role in the world and how it plays out. But in our last minute, or a few minutes, and I wanted to ask all of you to respond to this, we have kind of the meta question here that one of our audience has posed, and that is whether, taking all of these economic interests into account, the BRI, the Chinese role in some of its discussions in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere about providing, infrastructure investment and grant assistance to the region. Is this the beginning of a divorce or some kind of further divergence between the U.S. and our traditional friends and partners in the region? And then I would add, just layer on to that one additional aspect, and that is that looking at it from a U.S. policy perspective, does the U.S. strategy right now look right to you? Are there things that you believe that the United States should be doing in addition to or differently from what we're doing right now? And if we can kind of go in reverse order and ask Khalid first.
Well, as they say, good economics makes good politics. The more there's enhancing in the economic field, which then makes it the social field, yes, there'll be less problems because the interests are vital. Investments, both Saudi, in China, and the Chinese, not only, by the way, in the Gulf, in the ports around us, whether it's Kenya, Somalia, other areas, Djibouti, we are having all these. So I think it's very important that this happens. I think America has lost a bit. We will not disengage. America is still a power. I hate to use the word superpower, but still a power. We have many interests. We have investments there. We have our funds down there. So there will not be a turnaround. But yes, there are other pastures from where we can graze.
Thank you, Khalid. And let me ask Daniel next.
Yeah, thanks. I guess in some ways, what we are witnessing is a certain kind of evolution. People are describing it as decoupling of the global economy in specific sectors, and there is a potential that the Middle East and, say, Pakistan will find that in terms of their IT infrastructure, it's heavily dependent upon and reliant on Chinese backbone for both financial and other reasons. And of course, their economic relations will be increasingly enmeshed with the Chinese. And where that makes some need for the United States to sort of break away or draw some lines with these countries, I think we may see more of that as we go. But as Khaled just pointed out, there's a long way to go before the United States is disengaged from this region. I mean, I think we need to recognize the scale of U.S. involvement on, say, issues with the Saudis and others in the Gulf of military ties and defense sales and so on, so outstrip what the Chinese are doing and create a pressure for continued relations over time because of a desire to continue to invest in similar types of systems that, again, make it hard to imagine a disentangling too rapidly. In terms of U.S. responses to this, the only thing I would say is the United States doesn't need to overreact to Chinese influence. Not everything that China is going to do in this region disadvantages the United States. The Saudi-Iran deal, though China gets the credit, isn't bad for the United States, as far as I can tell. Maybe at the margins, there will be some complexities created by it, but generally, more stability in the region probably serves U.S. purposes. And so the United States doesn't need to respond to every last thing or move that the Chinese make. It certainly shouldn't try to respond in kind. We've, I think, to some extent, made certain of those errors as the Chinese got very involved in infrastructure investment. And I think many Americans thought we had to match them dollar for dollar. We don't. And I also think that we should that the Chinese get involved, particularly in politics, in places from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia to Iran and beyond. They may be as likely to breed contempt and frustration with Beijing and Beijing's meddling, direct or indirect, intentional or unintentional. And that'll create complexities that China will have to navigate as it, I think, arrives as a major power across the world. And that's not bad for the United States either. So, we don't have to sort of match them. We should watch as this unfolds. There are some benefits to seeing China get more deeply engaged in a very difficult and messy region. We've witnessed that ourselves. Let's see how the Chinese manage it.
Indeed. Syed Mohammed, and also if you wanted to roll in the Indian as well.
Yeah, I mean, the India has a longer comment, and I think it's interesting how the Middle Eastern states, as Arif brought this up, are sort of tepid on the Kashmir issue because of economic interest. But again, that's as India's influence grows, how sort of ideology or sort of that kind of solidarity versus economic and realpolitik interest. So I don't know in a nutshell, how China's involvement, growing influence with the Middle East is gonna sort of temper their desire to also forge closer ties with India. But I wanted to quickly also talk about three issues vis-a-vis the US and its relationship with the Indian subcontinent. And I mean, this is an issue, I think the US study group also spoke about sort of this kind of dwindling capacity for the US to, act as a referee within the Indian subcontinent in terms of crisis management. And I wonder what the thinking is in terms of, given this sort of what has been called the strategic chain, right? So any time that there's an effort to bring sort of this contestation to the Himalayan shelf, it's going to automatically trigger Pakistani insecurity. So how will that be managed? But I do think, I mean, Pakistan has for good or bad, I mean, has had a very long-standing, relationship with the US. It plugs into the global political economy. Now, I say good or bad because it is elite captured, but I mean, it is the largest market for Pakistani exports. I mean, which is certainly not going to be the case. The US is the largest market for Pakistani exports, and China will never be that. And I think for the US, I mean, it has not been able to, do reconstruction opportunity zone for Afghanistan. It wasn't able to over the last 2 decades for Pakistan and Afghanistan to bring their economic sort of interests closer. But the US could, I think, in some ways, and climate is perhaps an issue, it is not a zero-sum game. And when it comes to sort of collaborating, and seeing what it can do for the Indian subcontinent in ways that does not antagonize India and jeopardize its strategic relationship, because the water issue is going to become big with the glacial melt on the one hand, and then it can also, I mean, with the SEZs, there's an opportunity if the economic sort of imperatives are right. I mean, Pakistan's been wanting investments in the special economic zones created by the BRI and has been asking for American investments. Now, I don't know how attractive that is from the profit-making perspective, but that in turn would sort of lessen Pakistan's reliance on Chinese sort of, dependence, economic dependence. So there are opportunities here.
Great. Thank you, Syed Mohammed. And Yun, last word is with you.
Yes, sir. Well, I was at a discussion last week at the Arab Center of Washington, and the focus is on U.S. pivot to Asia. And what does it mean? Whether it's a fact or whether it's a reality or a myth, and what does it mean for the Middle East? I think from all the discussions that we have had with people from the region, there is a sense of anxiety about U.S. either dropping the region because of war in Ukraine, or U.S. dropping the region because of the Indo-Pacific strategy and this renewed focus on great power competition. And like Dan said, U.S. security commitment and the role that U.S. carries in the region, economically, politically, or militarily, is still significant. It's undeniable. But I do see that this anxiety and this skepticism from the region does do damage to U.S. credibility and to this perception of somehow China is going to displace the United States in the region. So I really think that U.S. policy would benefit from some level of clarity of its renewed commitment or of its sustained commitment to the region, and what it means in the context of great power competition, and what it means when Washington appears to be focused on competition with China on a daily basis. And what are the policy implications for the region? Otherwise, the region will believe, and some would say that the region already believes, that the U.S. is trying to minimize its resources and its input to the region while trying to achieve the same goals. Well, are we trying to achieve the same goals, or have our goals evolved because the priority has shifted? So I think that level of clarity or some type of clarification will benefit the region and U.S. greatly. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. We've run out of time. In fact, we've gone a little bit over our time. I want to thank our great panelists, Syed Mohammed Ali, Khalid Al-Maina, Daniel Markey, and Yun Sun, for a very interesting and insightful conversation. And most of all, I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us today. Until the next time, this is Jerry Firestein for the Middle East Institute